Natural selection molds evolution. Adaptations that are advantageous enhance reproductive success. Let's look at this example of bacteria growing on a plate. We looked at this earlier in the semester, but we'll just review it again real briefly, this time through the lens of natural selection. Remember that this is an agar plate that has different levels of antibiotic. On the outer edges of this petri dish, we have an area with 0. 0 indicates that there's 0 amount of antibiotic. As we move in, there's an area with 1 unit of antibiotic, and as we go in, there's 10 times that amount, then 100 times, and finally in the middle, 1,000 times potency of antibiotic. So in the center should be a very, very difficult place for bacteria to grow. Bacteria are introduced to the outside edges and they quickly grow and colonize the areas that have no antibiotic. But you can see this arrow points to an area where there's a small outgrowth going into the area of antibiotic. This outgrowth represents a single bacteria that was resistant. It was a mutant that was born with resistance to antibacterial. And that bacteria was able to reproduce. And so that little area that the arrow is pointing to, that's actually a whole population of descendants of this mutant. These descendants all inherited the ability to resist antibiotics. You can see that this mutation occurs several times, but it occurs separately. So all of these little clouds that are entering the area with antibiotic represent descendant populations from mutants that were occurring in that original population. Eventually, they completely colonize the area that has 1 times dose of antibiotic, and then they start to enter the area with 10 times antibiotic. But again, they're stopped at that line, and a new mutation has to occur with even more resistance. They continue to grow, finally entering the area with 100 times antibiotic. And predictably so, you can see that now we have mutations from the 100 times antibiotic area entering the 1,000 times antibiotic area. Remember that all of these different streams, they all represent different areas and different sources of that genetic mutation that led to the same kind of advantage, the ability to resist antibiotic. Here you can see the many different mutations that all led to the same adaptive form. That adaptive form is a bacteria that is highly resistant to antibiotic. This example illustrates in one of the most simple and clearest ways the mechanism of natural selection and evolution. Another way that natural selection molds evolution is the way that natural selection eliminates poorly adapted phenotypes. Remember that a phenotype is the expressed form of your genotype. This is the only way that natural selection can act on you. Here we have 2 examples of a pair of moths, and in each example, one of the pair is more obvious than in the other picture. On the left, you can see that the light moth stands out on the dark background. The dark moth is almost impossible to see. On the right, you can see that the dark moth is easy to spot, but the light moth is almost completely invisible. Predators in both of these environments would likely select for one colored moth over the other. In this experiment, thousands of moths were released over a period of 6 years in a site that was unpolluted. This site had healthy lichen growing on the trees, so it looked more like the picture on the right with the light-colored background. After a period of 6 years, the average recapture rate of dark moths was much lower than the recapture rate of light moths. This pattern can be seen in other places too. Here we have an extinct lava flow in the Mojave Desert. The dark background of the lava provides an interesting experiment that happened naturally. You can see that around these extinct lava flows, there's very light alluvial sands. Here you can see the line defining the lava flow when it meets the alluvial sands. These side blotch lizards were captured both on the granite and on the lava flows. You can see that the granite lizards are much lighter in color, whereas the lizards that were captured on the lava flow are much darker. This would suggest that there's some kind of advantage to having a darker color on a dark background. Similarly, there's an advantage to having a light color on a light background. Natural selection does not have a goal. While it does select for the best adapted individuals in a population, natural selection itself is not stewarding a path. Evolution does not have an end goal in mind, and so there's no more evolved or less evolved state. We're just constantly presented with populations that are represented by survivors of many, many, many generations. What do I mean by that? This is Pinus radiata, a pine tree from California. Pinus radiata grows 7 times faster in New Zealand than it does in California. Similarly, Eucalyptus globulus is highly invasive in California. It's from Tasmania and South Australia. It seems as though if evolution had a goal, it could have evolved plants that did this well in these environments. But since the evolutionary pressures in these environments never cause them to achieve these growth rates, they simply don't exist in these other environments. So what is survival of the fittest? Biological fitness is different than our colloquial ideas of what fitness is. We usually think of fitness as being some measure of health, maybe your ability to run really far or lift heavy weights or do something like that. Well, biological fitness is different. Biological fitness describes individual reproductive success and is equal to the average contribution to the gene pool of the next generation that is made by individuals of the specified genotype or phenotype. In this study, the genetic relationship between individuals in several parts of the world was compared to the genetic information of Genghis Khan. It was found that 0.5% of present-day humans are related to Genghis Khan. That's 1 in 200. In that way, Genghis Khan had very high biological fitness. The pressures of natural selection can have a wide range of effects on populations. Let's look at some of those effects here. One of those effects is stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, a more refined, fine-tuned, and specific morphology is selected for. In this case, the number of eggs in a nest is an amount that is selected for, because if there's too many eggs, then it's difficult for the mother to provide for all of the chicks. Whereas if there's too few, well, there's no guarantee that they'll all grow up into fledglings. In directional selection, a new form present in the original population is selected for, and the frequencies of that new form become more common. In this case, the original population is a mottled moth that has both black and white spots. Perhaps this population has incurred an event where all of the trees were covered in soot. After the fact, only the individuals with more dark mottling were selected for. That is, only individuals with more dark mottling were able to survive predation events by birds. After a while, the whole population became darker. In diversifying selection, there's a bifurcation of the original population. It becomes split into 2 groups. In this case, we have an original population of a rabbit that has light fur. But perhaps there's 2 different substrates, there's 2 different backgrounds in this environment, one of which is dark and the other is mottled. Maybe there's rocks around. Well, in this instance, the rabbits that were on the dark background would do well when they had dark fur, and the population of rabbits that live on rocky backgrounds would do better when they have marbled fur. The intermediate form, the light-furred rabbit, wouldn't do well in either habitats. So in this case, the selection splits the average. It splits the original population into 2 different forms.